Welcome to Books and Ideas Audio, a presentation of the Vancouver Writers Fest. The Vancouver Writers Fest connects people to exceptional books, ideas, and dialogue through year-round programming that ignites a passion for words and the world around us. I'm Leslie Hertig, Artistic Director, and I'm very happy to share this conversation featuring Pulitzer Prize-winning author Ayad Akhtar in conversation with CBC's Eleanor Wachtel about his new novel, Homeland Elegies. This event was recorded on October 6, 2020. Special thanks to CBC Radio and Writers & Company for their collaboration. The Vancouver Writers Fest carries out its work, including this event you're about to listen to, on the unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And now, Ayad Akhtar and Eleanor Wachtel.
Family is at the heart of your new novel, Homeland Elegies, especially the relationship between father and son. What makes this such rich terrain for you?
Wow, that's a good question. It's a big question. I think that requires a level of self-awareness that I'm gonna try to fake here. I don't know. I mean, I think, as an immigrant son, as an eldest son of an immigrant family, the first, my parents were both the first to leave their countries from their families, respectively. There's a lot of expectation and a lot of investment in what there was in me, a lot of love, and I think that the decisions that I made in my life, I think they were very consequential for my parents, and the consequences on my parents were obviously very consequential on me. And the decision to become a writer, which really wasn't so much a decision as it was a kind of inevitability when I had a high school teacher in my sophomore year of high school who really changed my life. And I never looked back. I never wanted to do anything else but be committed to stories and writing and all of that sort of stuff. From that point forward, I think it was a long journey, sort of my parents kind of understanding what it was I was getting into and what it was all about. And then, the next level of it, which was writing about them and writing about what we had all been through in various forms, whether, it was novels or plays or whatever it was that I've written over the years. So, beyond that, I had a larger than life father. I mean, he was, I remember encountering Falstaff in Henry IV's parts 1 and 2 for the first time and feeling like, oh yeah, I've got a beat on that character. He's a lot like my dad, actually. So, I think that there was he was a man of very, very large appetites, and I experienced so much of what the world was through him and through his experiences. So, I think there's some particularities, just the fact of the parents that I had, they're uniquely dramatic, their dramatic natures, if you will, and on the other hand, my position within the sort of immigrant family, if you will.
Can you tell me a little about your father's background, the world that shaped him?
Sure. My dad grew up in a very rural and rugged part of northern Pakistan, and his family was the only really sort of like highly educated family in that area. His dad had been sent to the tribal areas as a kind of supervisor of agricultural education. And so they were Punjabis living in a very sort of non-Punjabi atmosphere. But my dad kind of grew up, he often used to say to me, if I had more to do with bringing you up, you wouldn't be so sheltered. He really grew up on the streets, if you will. So was a very wily and kind of canny person, but was also came from a family of sort of, a lot of education generation after generation. He ended up becoming a doctor and was top of his class in the late 60s and came over to America on a program that at the time, it was post-Kennedy, the quotas had changed for South Asians coming to the United States, and they were looking for, the U.S. State Department was looking for engineers and doctors and scientific talent. So he came over on a program that gave him a visa, a plane ticket, an apartment, and a job. And my mom came over on the same program. She was 2 years behind him in medical school. So they came in the late 60s, and my dad ended up, he always says fortuitously, in the first laboratory that was focused on heart arrhythmias. It was pacemaker technologies and all of that sort of stuff really, came from the few people that came out of that laboratory in Staten Island. And after a few years at that lab, he was invited to open a laboratory carte blanche, the first of its kind in the Midwest, at the University of Wisconsin, where he ended up going on to become one of the world's premier sort of specialists of arrhythmias technology and whatnot. So it was a real, American journey in a lot of ways, a lot of success and also a kind of darker side. My dad was, as I said earlier, had larger than life appetites, and towards the end of his life, it really took a toll on him.
Well, as you've described him, he was, extraordinary, generous, brilliant, but also tortured. I mean, a sort of self-made, self-styled businessman, entrepreneur, doctor, but he had his demons. He drank, gambled, had affairs, made and lost 2 fortunes. What do you think drove him?
Oh, gosh. Wow. What a question. Wow. What drove him? It's hard to say. He was a man of such enormous paradoxes. He started the largest, what would end up becoming the largest cardiology group in the state of Wisconsin. And, they were doing billions of dollars in business. And, there was staff of 80 doctors. And I remember asking him, how much he was making one year. And he told me, and I was surprised that it was that little. And I said, well, how much are the doctors that are bringing in the most money, how much are they making? And he told me that $3-4 million, and he was making, really a fraction of that. Basically, was paying himself as head of the group a fraction of that. I said, well, why would you pay yourself so much less than the other doctors on? He said, well, because leadership. I can't be seen as double dealing. I can't be seen as trying to get ahead over my colleagues. I mean, if I'm their leader, I need to be making decisions in everybody's best interest. Now, I can't be interpreted that way. And so on the one hand, here's this incredibly sort of fair-minded, very, very leadership-oriented, cared about the nurses and cared about everybody, all the way down, the techs, the doctors, the patients. And on the other hand, somebody who, as you said earlier, made and lost 2 fortunes and gambled, and it's all kinds of weird paradoxes throughout the course of my dad's career, course corrections, and so it's hard to understand what the through line is, other than the appetite for life. Really, I mean, I think that my dad was both he had a kind of penchant for some of the darker things in life, but he also was an incredibly noble person. It's a and I think my understanding of dramatic character, my ability to sort of nest contradiction and brook contradiction within the understanding of a person really comes in a large part from studying my father so closely. I mean, being around somebody who embodied so many contradictory impulses over the years.
I know. I mean, I was reading somewhere that when you talk about noble, that he once essentially gave his Audi to the valet at a favorite restaurant, sold it to him for $1. Oh
my God, I mean, he did that kind of stuff all the time. One year he rented out the largest theater in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, called the Pabst Theater, this old glory down in downtown, and it's a 3,000 some seat theater, and rented it out and flew Ravi Shankar into Milwaukee to give a free concert to the people of Milwaukee, and so the house was filled to the gills, and my dad gets up on stage and he says, this man you are going to hear, he is a god, he's a living god. If I hear any of you talking during this concert, I will hang you from the ceiling. So he says this to 3,000 people, right, on stage as a way of introduction to Ravi Shankar, and then proceeds to go out into the hallway and yap through the entire first half of the concert on a cell phone. I mean, you can't make this stuff up.
Well, I also, if Falstaff is your model, I mean, what's a poor writer to do?
Well, no, exactly. It really is. There are few characters that contain those kinds of contradictions and have, such an extraordinarily generous man, but also, at the end of his life, as the father in the book, who's obviously largely based on my dad, drops $2 million in a local casino in a year. It's like, almost no thought to, in a way, what would that money have, how could that have benefited others? And I don't mean myself. I didn't, that was not in my thought process. I felt like I had made my way and I wanted to make my own way. But it's just one of those things where, it's just they're hard contradictions to square. And what is the thing? What's the prime number, right? That at the root of all that? I don't know. I'll keep turning that question over. It's the first time anybody's asked me that question, actually. So in a way, it's the first time I've asked that question so directly of myself. Was
he ever content, do you think?
In moments, I think, he loved to fish and he loved, if Green Bay was winning a football game, he was really happy. And, I think he found a unique and very intense pleasure from some of my success that I have, had in the last 10 years or so. But I think it was all passing. I think he was not somebody who was necessarily, he was not hunting happiness. But I think he was somebody whose unhappiness hunted him a little bit. And maybe if he had been more willing to sort of attend to his own happiness, maybe the end wouldn't have been so hard for him.
In your novel, the father is called upon to treat Donald Trump back in the 1990s and becomes an ardent supporter of Trump when he enters politics. What did he admire in him?
In the book, the father, who is, as I said earlier, largely based on my own dad, spends this time with Trump in the mid-'90s, treating him part of a cohort of doctors that are taking care of some heart rhythm issues that Trump is having in the book, and he has this exposure to a kind of certain vision of American life, a kind of glamour, an ersatz glamour that almost shimmers all the more powerfully because it's so shallow in a way, But the access to the helicopter rides from the heliport to Trump Tower or whatever kind of access to the Robin Leach version of the lifestyles of the rich and famous in America, like that dream of the American dream, that form of the American dream, which of course we know in Trump's case has been fueled by gargantuan amounts of debt, and rich ultimately is gossamer thin, But in the book, my father falls for this vision of American success, this kind of individualism on steroids, if you will, debt fueled and released from the consequences of anything, truth or debt or history or whatever. I think that relationship that I portray in the book is at the root of the kind of I'm trying to get at the emotional core of what the American fascination is with this kind of pursuit of wealth, even if it's totally false, right? Because I think that at root, that's part of what Trump's appeal has been. It's been this performance of however many decades now where he performs success, and we or many of us sort of fall for the performance. And even if we have a sense that the performance isn't quite the reality, we like the performance so much that we don't care, And I think that gap between illusion and reality is something that's kind of taken over our culture in so many ways, and is of course at root the formal device of my novel, because many readers spend so much time wondering what's real and what's not real.
Yeah, exactly. I wanted to ask you that because I was carefully saying that in the novel, the father, without asking if that was your father, and you mine your own experience for your work, both plays and novels. And in Homeland Elegies, the line is especially blurred because the narrator bears your name and shares much of your story. What made you want to tease or confound the reader in this way?
Well, it seemed to me that it was a complex moment, and one of the complexities of being a writer of fiction in this moment was recognizing how the audience's attention is shifting, and how the window of the reader's concentration is narrowing, and how that intense focus on the present has become habituated to a light from thing to thing, from discrete fragment of information to discrete fragment of information, without the through line of an argument, without the through line of a narrative, because the social media platforms, whether it's Instagram or Twitter or whether it's breaking news on television, seem to be curating our pleasure principle in this particular way, to be focused intensely on what's happening right now, almost to the exclusion of any bigger picture. So recognizing that was a kind of formal reality that I was going to be dealing with on the one hand, and on the other, the idea that fiction, at least in my hands, I couldn't imagine a third person novel or obviously first person fictional narrator who could I couldn't get my arms around the crazy political realities that have unfolded in this country. Reality, or so-called quote unquote reality, has outpaced fiction's capacity to deal with it. And invariably, whatever I was to write, the extent to which it was going to have a political bent or political nature, was going to feel like satire. And it felt to me like I just didn't want to write satire. This is a very serious moment. The consequences of our lust for unreality are profound and serious. I wanted to write a serious book that addressed the realities and the philosophical conundrums of where we are. I wanted to write a philosophical novel that had all of the addictive thrill of reality television, because that's the only place I felt that I could go ultimately to make sense of what was happening. So, and then the last piece of it really was that I think I see the dominant story of the dominant narrative mode of our moment as the self. Everybody is curating the image of the self and presenting it to others and sort of curating it for their own sake. We are increasingly relating to the world and processing experience through the narrative of what does it mean for me? Who's listening to me? When is my story going to get out there? Et cetera, et cetera. We have this advertising push where everything begins with my account or my car or my insurance, and this idea that the self is more central than anything else, and we take it from advertising, but in fact it's become a narrative mode at this point. So that too was part of it. Staging the self, the narrator narrating his or her own experience, and doing it in a way that collapsed fact and fiction, so that it could, in a way, make a place for the prurient sensationalism that I knew I would have to include in the book to keep the reader's attention.
So you didn't want to write memoir because you wanted the freedom of expanding or making it more sensational or seducing. I wouldn't have
known how to write a memoir. I'm a dramatic writer. I thrive on contradiction and opposition. I thrive on the sharp edge. I thrive on the swift narrative turn. I thrive on all of the formal constraints of strong dramatic storytelling, moving characters from one pole to the opposite. The habits of my mind would have been so constrained by a need to hew to the actual facts. It just I wouldn't even know how to do it. I had to forget my life, if you will, in order to write the book, and then just pilfer and pillage from my own life and those of my parents in order to tell this tale. And the tale I'm telling is the tale of America. And so ultimately, it was less important to get to remain accurate to the actual events of my life or my parents' lives, because I was asking the reader to hold this story to a different standard of truth, a higher, more metaphorical standard of whether or not it could account for the dilemmas that have engulfed us as a nation.
Because the novel opens boldly with a letter addressed to America, an overture, and there's an urgency and energy to it right off the top. Where did that come from? I mean, the inspiration for the book, the vision behind it, because it's not just the family's experience as immigrants to the U.S. I mean, that's at the core, but the theme of the novel is so much bigger than that.
Yeah. I was in Rome, and I was at the American Academy in Rome, and my mother had recently passed away, and my father was, as I said, showing signs of demise, imminent demise, almost daily dramas around his drinking and whatnot. And Trump was our president, and I had been watching what was happening in the state of Wisconsin, where I'm from, for quite some time. The sort of devolution of our politics and the increasing temperature of the social body. It's almost like the country was in a fever, and I was disturbed on the one hand by everything that I was seeing, much of which was not a surprise to me because I felt that I'd been observing it for some time. I've been quoting recently this Chinese proverb, which goes something like this: in a house where the son kills the father, the causes do not lie between the morning and the evening of a single day. And to me, a lot of the changes that had been unfolding in American life, these divides between urban and rural and heartland and the coasts, and the economic divides, the racial divides, these were a long time in the making. And the ideology around money and finance, to me, has been an important part of that story, which has been hard to tell because everybody wants to hear some story about identity. They want to hear how inequality, racial or identity inequality is really at root the disease that's plaguing the republic, which I don't think is the case. I think that's a problem, but it's not the fatal illness that's choking us. But anyway, so I've been trying to think about how to write about all of this for some time, and I was at the American Academy, as I said, and I came across a poem by Leopardi, written some 200 years ago, entitled "To Italy." And I remember thinking, as I was reading the poem, he's addressing his fellow Italians and trying to remind them of what they once were and how far they'd fallen and all of that sort of, tropey stuff. But it ignited a thought in me, which was, would it be possible to summon a voice that could address my fellow Americans? And of course, a very grandiose thought, but I went to bed that night, and the next morning I woke up, and the first sentence of this book was already forming itself, and I spent the next few days writing that overture to America, inspired by Leopardi's poem "To Italy." So, that set in motion the writing, which just flowed from that point forward, an exploration of America from the perspective of a family that had been here for a half century, and a narrator who was the son of immigrants who was not just preoccupied by his station in life and his parents' station in life, but by trying to understand what had gone wrong with the Republic, if you will.
Homeland Elegies is not about being Muslim in America, but you say that's a useful vantage point, maybe even a privileged one, to look at what's become of the country. How so?
Well, I think that being Muslim in America is an interesting perspective because, on the one hand, post 9/11, I think a lot of the fault lines, a lot of the sort of overt notions of belonging and the kind of consequences of being on the wrong side of those fault lines are of course clear. It's not exclusive to Muslims. I think that minorities of all sorts go through that experience. But I think that married to a perspective within the country and having that perspective being here, there's also the perspective of the very vivid consequences of American foreign policy. We as Muslims from living in this country have family members from across the planet whose lives have been deeply informed, affected, and in often cases ended by American intervention in the world because of the aftermath of 9/11. And I think that one of the unfortunate realities of American life is that even 19 years later, we still, as Americans, seem to have so little understanding of what 9/11, where it came from, what it was about, and what it has meant for us, and how we, in our inability to process the wound in any meaningfully productive way, have gone about and set about sort of inflicting the wound on others. And I think that the combination of that sort of inter and intra perspective, the within the country and without the country perspective on American identity and what American strength or the American persona has meant, and what that kind of can give you a pretty whole picture of what America has become. one of the things that I've been speaking about quite a bit of late is that if we are, dealing with a world order that has basically begun to fall apart, and the organized crime model of leadership has risen everywhere, criminals being in power increasingly across the planet, that one of the central strands of this is the destruction of the world order initiated by the United States. Endless wars, many of which were nonsensical in terms of the genesis of, really coming from 9/11. But they emanated from that need for vengeance, that need for, responding in that way. So that's, when I talk about, perhaps being Muslim in America is a privileged perspective in order to understand America in the 21st century, that's really what I'm getting at.
But when you say it's not about identity politics or race, it's something else, something bigger. What do you have in mind?
Well, I think that I think we don't ask the question meaningfully anymore what collective good is, right? And I think we certainly don't ask it on a policy level. We've, in the last 40 years or so, have legislated and idealized the wholesale selling off of our national infrastructure in order to benefit individuals. And we enshrine the accumulation of individual wealth. We idealize it. We idolize those who do it, even when they do it at great expense to their communities that they come from or to the nation. A Walmart moves into a town, opens a big box store, and 86 cents of every dollar spent at that Walmart leaves. But it's not just that, not just the money leaving the community. It's also all the businesses that go out of business because of the presence of that big box store. And what's the justification to the community? What's the rationale? What is the social logic that enables this kind of forest fire, this corporate forest fire that is destroying so much of the heartland? Well, it's the lowest price. Walmart will give the residents of these communities a lower price. And so that becomes the rationale to incinerate the stakeholdership of almost every other participant within the chain. And we see this thinking at work now for 40 years, and it's part of why we have these huge technological behemoths who are transforming our very cognitive function in order to make money for themselves. So we're very much in the grip of a kind of monopolistic scale gone awry, and I don't know what the corrective is going to be. But again, enabled by this idea that the individual, whether the individual's right to a lower price or whether it's the individual's right to make as much money as they want, or the individual's right to have as many guns as they want or to use whatever bathroom they want. This is the kind of thinking that seems to animate the moral imagination of our country. But these are not sufficient considerations to be able to build a definition of a collective good. And where's the sacrifice? What are we sacrificing? We don't have a definition of a collective good. Moreover, we don't have any meaningful sacrifice to that collective. Everything is about, as JFK once said, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Well, who asks what we can do for our country anymore? So, it's not to litigate this matter, in the lapse of any particular, concerns or what have you. It's just to identify what has transformed the philosophical and intellectual and moral landscape of the country. And at the end of the day, I think the book makes a case that it's really the economics that lead. That when you change the economics and when you change the incentives, you change how people's bread is buttered, you're going to change behavior, and that's going to change ideas over time.
Yeah, I'd like to talk more about that shortly, but Akhtar, I wanted to talk a little more about your family and upbringing, which you draw on in the novel. You've talked about your father's outsized personality and appetites. Your mother was very different, and their relationship was a difficult one. What were some of the issues between them?
I think my mom was she was much more she was definitely a much more reserved person and enjoyed a quiet life, if you will. which she almost never had with my dad. She was a contemplative person. She was very philosophical, if you will. Loved to read Marcus Aurelius and Balthazar Gracian, and liked to be sitting around with her sons talking about things rather than out sort of doing something like my dad always wanted to be. So he would always chide me and my brother about staring at paper all day long, meaning we were reading. And didn't understand what it was we were finding in books that was more fun than what you could find out in the world, and it's and that paradox, the sort of interior versus exterior, or sort of bookish versus worldly, those are the polarities that I grew up with, very much embodied by my parents, and my mom, whereas my dad, I think, believed for, and did, actually thrive for quite some time in this country. I think my mom always felt that she couldn't understand what was so great about this country, so much so that she had given up so much to be here, and she wasn't sure that it was worth the trade-off, and spent a good part of her life, I think, homesick in various ways. And I think it's probably the story of a lot of immigrants, who miss home, who never find a sense of belonging in their new countries, but though they make good lives, perhaps, or they come here to sacrifice for their kids or whatnot. But so yeah, I mean, and that was the kind of the portrait of the binary that's very much also in the book, but it was represented in my life too.
And did you feel more your mother's son, or
my dad definitely thought I was more my mom's son, and my mom definitely thought I was more my dad's son.
Oh, I see.
It was a constant struggle. I mean, anytime, my dad was a little bit more accepting of me being my mom's son, but my mom really she couldn't countenance the ways in which I resembled my dad, or any kind of like wisdom that I because my dad had a lot of wisdom about how to be in the world, and there was a lot to learn from him, and as far as she was concerned, it was all just horseshit.
Well, your mother had gone through a lot. I mean, she had witnessed the horrors of partition. What happened to her?
Well, again, in the book, my mom is, as in real life, she was born before partition, as was my father, and my mother also did actually come from a part of Pakistan where there was a lot of violence. And those early scenes of partition, which are iconic, I mean, they're things that anybody writing about partition often comments on, the sort of extraordinarily horrific, gruesome things that folks would see at the train stations of dead bodies, chopped up bodies being unloaded from trains that were bringing people from India to Pakistan, and sort of going that direction, Hindu mobs that would board the trains and kill all the Muslims, and going the other direction, Muslim mobs killing all the Hindus returning or going to India. And so the level of violence was, extraordinary, and it's an important part of the story of Pakistan and India, and one that continues to play out. It's one that folks often don't know much about. In fact, many times don't even know that Pakistan and India were once one country, and not so long ago, actually. So, all of that is part and parcel of the mother's perspective on life in America. One of the challenges with writing this book, which I was writing, it's an American tale, an American story, and a portrait of this country. But in order to tell that story, I had to account for the one who was telling it, meaning myself. And in order to account for my perspective and my point of view, I had to account for the history that made me. And so part of that history is partition, because it's what made my parents. Partition is an important part of their makeup. And so that's passed on to me one way or the other. And so I tell that story a little bit in the book, just to sort of contextualize some of the conversations and some of the attitudes towards the American experiment that my mother had.
But in connection with your mother, and I think this is something you've said about your mother rather than something I've got from the book, you've mentioned post-colonial rage. Mm-hmm. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think that, one of the things that is often, I get a lot of grief for any time I talk about this with any granularity, but Islamist views have had much deeper support in the Muslim world than people understand or realize. And, part of the mischaracterization or the misconstrual of what Islamist views ultimately, some of the political valences of those views, what those are about, I think that folks in the West really don't seem to understand their own participation in all of this stuff. It's as if, we're over here just living our lives, and we're drinking our beers and enjoying our lives, and then we got these people. They're so angry, and they come along and they just mess it up for us, and they want to. That's not history. That's a perspective, and that's a perspective that is, of course, profoundly uninformed. And I think that, we are seeing the rise of a kind of, this is not new, but I think the West is finally beginning to see a consolidated pushback against the heritage of colonialism. The despoiling of the so-called colonies for centuries. It's impossible to imagine the Enlightenment, say, this movement that has changed the world allegedly for the better, without sort of understanding how much it's predicated on rubber and sugar and slave trade. And, what conclusions to draw from that are perhaps, are up for debate, whether or not restitution should be made or whatnot. But what we can certainly recognize without there being any question or any controversy is that these policies, rightful or wrongful, have long-term emotional impacts on cultures, and there is a current of still burning post-colonial resentment across the planet. So in the book, my mother is someone who, because of the facts of her life and a man that she was in love with who was not my father, a love story of her own is I draw on that in order to sort of make an emotional case, an emotional narrative case for understanding a little bit better how American foreign policy or Western foreign policy, as it affects life in Pakistan in this case, has impact on people's emotions. And so she, at the end of the second chapter, says some pretty nasty things about America, and then those nasty things get quoted verbatim by another character in a play that I write. And then, of course, I'm trying to account for the fact that everyone's always asking me, is that what you think? Because everyone's trying to figure out where am I in these narratives? And so it's a kind of a puzzle, if you will, to try to explain the mysterious alchemy by which lived experience gets transformed into art. But yeah, speaking specifically to the question, if my father in the book is a kind of adherent or lover of Donald Trump, then my mother, in a way, drifts much closer to bin Laden than she does to Donald Trump. And between those two poles, between these two visions of America, one predatory and the other a kind of limitless franchise, that's where the narrator sits in between those two poles.
I wasn't even getting so far as to ask what you believed in terms of that, but more just your mother's belief, because it was your mother who uttered the line, as you were just saying in the novel, that you gave to your character Amir in your play Disgraced, an American-born man of Muslim origin who admits that as the Twin Towers were falling, he felt a sense of pride. In your play, it's a shocking admission, and from your mother, a disturbing statement. They deserve what they got and what they're going to get. Right.
Well, yeah. Again, I'm making a case for how a statement made in a play, which nobody can understand, how a character I write could utter and have it be plausible unless I believed it too. I'm trying to explain how there might be a much more complicated story behind a moment like that. And of course, the side effect of that is to demonstrate, the unimpeachable reality of these emotions, which are so foreign to so many people who don't deal with the consequences of imperial power.
Where do you think your mother found joy, or at least solace?
I think probably in her kids, in her sons. She seemed to derive more pleasure from any instance of me in the newsprint or on television that I could fathom. I mean, there was one interview I did, I think, in April of 2012 on PBS, as public broadcasting in the States. It wasn't really that big a deal, but it was a half an hour interview, and I guess I dressed nice or something, and I looked okay or whatever. And she would just play this thing. I mean, every day she would watch it for a few minutes. She would watch the whole thing, and she'd watch it again. And at one point, 2 or 3 years into this, I said, "Mom, you gotta. I mean, there's some other stuff you can watch too. You don't have to just watch me all the time." So, I think she got a big kick out of her sons and their growth and their success and their struggles and all of that sort of stuff. And she had some idiosyncratic joys. I mean, David Letterman was a real obsession with her toward the end of her life, and so was polka. And both are things which I draw on in the book, and I give to the mother in the book as well. So.
Your mother was sick for much of your childhood, and she was diagnosed with ovarian cancer just as you were starting school and battled numerous recurrences. How do you think that affected your relationship?
Oh, that's a good question. I've thought a lot about that, and I think done some therapy about it too. I feel like I have, but it's hard. I think when you're a kid, and this is stuff that I'm speaking above my pay grade here. I don't know, but I think that when you're very young and you're worried that your mom may not be with you, it may shut you down to some things. It may sort of it may protectively or preemptively make you less inclined to want to attach to that mother and maybe to other people as well. That would certainly account for certain tendencies that I've experienced in my personal life in that regard. And I do think that a fear of loss, that early fear of loss, which kept recurring throughout my childhood, probably formed me substantially. Maybe so much so that I can't even see the ways in which those knots, that my trunks were formed around those knots. I just see the trunks. I don't see the knots. But yeah, it was an important part of my childhood, her being sick.
Could you read from the novel? This is a scene with your mother, or your alter ego's mother,
yeah.
near the end of her life when she was 72.
Sure. One of the final proper conversations I had with her while she was still mostly in possession of all her wits, and with her habitual reserve softened by the approaching end, was about Pakistan, or our respective relationships to it. She was sitting up nibbling on a piece of freshly made laddu from the sizable new Indo-Pak grocery that had opened a couple of miles west of us in a strip mall behind the new casino that now sat where, when I was a child, there'd been a middle school. She was munching on that piece of besan laddu, its beige crumble adhering to her lips, when suddenly she stopped chewing. Her mouth sagged, her eyes welled, her voice quivered with sudden regret. "I'm so sorry, Mary Jaan." "For what, Mom? You don't have anything to be sorry about." "You were so happy there." "Where?" "Back home. You were always so happy back home." I paused, moved. With her end in view, her emotions had never been so clear, her face never as radiant. In moments like these, her beauty was heartbreaking. "Why are you apologizing?" "I never saw you like that here." "I don't know, Mom." No, she said with an endearing firmness. "I never did." And then all at once, shifting. "You didn't know that?" "What?" "That you were happier when you were there?" I smiled to hold her attention as I considered. The most vibrant of my childhood memories were those of life in my father's village and of the interlocking rooms in my mother's family's sprawling Rawalpindi bungalow. I loved being there, but I never pined for it when we returned. Not like she did. As a young boy, I often remarked how much happier she was when we were in Pakistan. I used to pray to God for her to be happy like that in America too. I was happy you were happy, Mom. It was nice to be with family. It was, wasn't it? And it was nice to not be in school. You didn't like school, she said, frowning playfully. No, I didn't. I'm sorry. That you made me go to school? No, she moaned, her face collapsing with sudden despair. What is it, Mom? I'm sorry we brought you here. Mom, I've had a good life here. She stared at me for a long moment, as if confused. You have? I'm happy. Her forehead creased with sudden concern. I don't think so. I am. I've always been a little serious, right? Isn't that what you say? Too serious. But it doesn't mean I'm not happy. Strange happiness. I get to do what I love. I'm a writer. Can you believe it? I smiled. I'm happy. She studied me for a moment, her head cocked cutely, a loving tenderness pouring into her eyes. That makes me happy, she said finally. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, I never really liked it here. I know, Mom. You do? She seemed both surprised and pleased to hear it. I nodded. Then her expression changed again abruptly, narrow with a troubled thought. What is it? I asked. Don't be mad. About what? You're one of them now. Write about them. Don't write about us.
Ayad Akhtar reading a scene from his new novel, Homeland Elegies. Did it hurt you to hear your mother say you were one of them?
No. No, I think she was encouraging me to, I think one of the things that frustrated her and maybe frustrates me at times was to be pigeonholed always as somebody writing about something that was perceived as other. And, in my own experience, I'm writing about love and greed and family and faith and murder and politics. I just happen to be writing about those things from the perspective of characters that I know, the characters I grew up with, the people I grew up with, who happen to be Muslim, happen to be Pakistani immigrants for the most part. But this notion that somehow I am, it's often perceived, or it seems to be sort of identified, that I'm writing from a particular to a particular, as opposed to writing from a particular to a universal. And, I think that has frustrated me, but it probably frustrated my mother even more. She would say, you're not a Muslim writer, you're a writer. I would always say to her, Mom, I'm happy somebody's paying any attention at all. I mean, I'm grateful that I have a chance to even have the conversation. So,
your narrator in the novel says he never felt truly loved by his mother, never felt that she saw him. Yeah. I think, I think that that's a complicated proposition in the book, because I think one of the things that the reader may recognize is that there's a certain self-involvement that the narrator seems to have, in which he seems to keep comes up against it in his relationships. He comes up against it in the final, encounters with his mother, and he comes up against it in the, climactic scene with his father. And so, I think perhaps the narrator makes a contention about something of that order, and it probably does map against my own experience of my mom. But there's another dimension to it as well. I think he does say at one point, it was kind of a simple realization: hadn't I denied myself what my mother could give me by wanting so badly what she couldn't, right? And I think there's some truth to that, at least in my case. I think that's something people can relate to. I think more broadly too.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny how the end of life, and that was one of the things that sort of created the emotional immediacy that resulted in this very, very intense engagement with language and with the reader and with the emotions of this story. It's so heightened at times. And I think, much of that comes from the encounters that I had with my parents as they were dying, as they were in decline, and sort of recognizing time is finite, and that if you don't say something, sometimes you don't have the opportunity to say it later. And similarly with regards to the country, and it may seem like a facile connection, but it's not. It's a very, very deeply felt one. It just felt like was time to say some things about America and about what has happened to the country, and that there was no reason to withhold any of it anymore, even if people weren't going to understand.
Ed Akhtar, you come from the so-called heartland of America. What was that like for you growing up in Wisconsin in the 1970s and 80s?
I loved Wisconsin. I mean, I still love Wisconsin. I had a lot of good friends. It was a very, very homogenous community, very, very white bread, very, very Lutheran, mostly, Northern European immigrant stock. But it was at the very earliest stages of transforming the area that we were in, earliest stage of transforming from a kind of rural area to an exurb, or like a beginning of a suburb, if you will. So I just, I don't know. I grew up with people who were very welcoming and sort of open-hearted. And, my fiance, who's from New York City, says that she didn't really understand something about me until she was in Wisconsin, and sort of something I'm sure a lot of Canadians can relate to, the sort of like people saying hi to you on the street and actually interested in how you're doing, and sort of these random conversations that'll happen between strangers in stores, and the kind of friendliness, not performative, but somehow just of the community, or of the spirit of the community. I grew up with that, and I never really felt excluded. I knew I was different, but in large part I knew I was different because I knew that we were different. It wasn't that people were making us feel different. And all of that changed after 9/11. And I think that, recently I've seen in the last 10 years that life in Wisconsin has changed a lot. The tensions, the heartland has undergone so much structural change, and so much profound structural and stressful change, that life has changed. The communal life has changed. There is a breakdown in not just civility, but a kind of open-heartedness that I bemoan, or I'm very sad to see happening. But I do recognize it comes from real suffering. But for the most part, I would say that I loved growing up there. I do feel very much like it's home, even though the whole question of home is a contested one for me.
Because
I am constantly asked to account for my difference, and I'm constantly described as somebody who is not just American but Muslim American, and that contrary, the Muslim part of it is a particularly difficult thing for people to conceptualize. Seeing the word Muslim is a little bit like hearing the word cancer in this country. And so having to deal with that all the time now for, 19, 20 years, it just wears on you. It just makes you, it makes you wonder where you can really rest. I don't blame anybody for it. I don't feel personally slighted by individuals who, I recognize the reflex, I recognize the impulse, I understand the social context, but it does have an emotional impact over time. And I think that in my case, I'm fortunate because I get to write about it. And I think that some of the folks that I've known over the years who don't get to write about it, I've seen how it's transformed their lives. And, growing up as the kid of Muslim immigrants post 9/11 has been really, really hard. So, yeah, I mean, I had the good fortune of really becoming an adult before that. But yeah, it takes a toll.
When you were growing up, your family made frequent visits home to Pakistan. What impression did that leave on you?
I loved it. It was, the whole notion of being with an extended family is, dozens of cousins and aunts and uncles and, parents, brothers and sisters and both sets of grandparents and, all of that sort of stuff. Those were all experiences that were indissociable for me from Pakistan. I didn't have those experiences outside of that context. So for the homeland, if you will, my parents' homeland was a kind of familial homeland. And so there was a kind of sense of familial belonging, even though from a very young age it was clear to me I was not Pakistani, that I was a very American kid. And again, didn't bother me. I knew that we would be going back to America, and I had school in America, and I had friends in America. But I loved being there too. And as I said in the section that I read, the narrator describes, some of his most vivid experiences in his father's village, and those, of course, are my experiences too. But I think, I'm sure it's an experience that folks have when the thing I'm describing as bifurcated is something that's maybe a little bit more unified for folks when, their families are in the same country that they are from. So.
And partly as a result of those visits to Pakistan, you went through your own religious phase as a child from around age 7. It wasn't something you actually grew up with in your household, but this is a story you tell in your first novel, American Dervish.
Right.
What inspired this?
I think I had a sensitivity to the splendor of creation, maybe as many children do. And I had an active mind at a young age, and I wanted to understand what this grand creation was all about. And there wasn't really anything in my experience that seemed to address that. My parents were particularly religious, and so I wasn't really brought up in the kind of tales of the numinous or of creation or whatever. So I naturally, I think, gravitated to wherever it was going to be able to be found in my context. And just had some aunts back in Pakistan who were very, who used to tell me those stories about the prophet and whatnot. And, the other example that I often give is when I was 10, I saw The Empire Strikes Back, and, those sequences between Yoda and Luke Skywalker in the swamp, in Dagobah Swamp, those were similar. They addressed the same realm of mystery and splendor. I remember reading Jonathan Edwards, the great Puritan theologian, had wrote something called Personal Narrative, which is sort of his history of his relationship of coming to God, and writes about his own experiences as a child walking through the fields and feeling the sweetness of the Lord in the flowers and in the trees as a very young boy. And I remember reading Personal Narrative and thinking, wow, yeah, that's very similar to how that was my childhood too. So I think it was something devotional about me and something sort of, extra sensitive maybe in that way, that was looking for a text to make sense of what this was all about.
And really, Luke Skywalker brought it on too?
Oh yeah. Oh my God. Yoda.
I know. I'm being heretical. I know. I shouldn't say.
No. You're not being heretical. It really was such a powerful the articulation. And it was by design, really. As we now know, George Lucas was cribbing from Joseph Campbell and was trying to fashion a myth, a myth for the times that would secure access for an audience to the sacred mystery of life, that's really the goal of the hero's journey. And so by design, that was what Lucas was doing, and I think he pulled it off really quite well with this whole relationship between Yoda, Obi-Wan, and young Luke. I mean, this notion of pedagogy, of learning what matters in life, and the way in which behavior and comportment are they're reflections of a deeper relationship to reality, and that they have mysterious effects. That when we behave certain ways, they affect that affects not only our life but the lives of others. And I don't mean some kind of well-intentioned post John Mill romantic version of collective good. I'm speaking about the mystery of our interconnection. So yeah, no, he definitely got it, and I'm not sure that the later Star Wars films do such a good job of it, but that early one does.
You say you're no longer a practicing or even believing Muslim, but that Islam is part of your artistic and spiritual inspiration, that you're interested in the Quran as myth and literature, an idea that I think many believers might regard as blasphemous. So
Indeed.
How does that approach enrich your appreciation of Scripture?
I spend a lot of time reading Scripture, whether it's Old Testament or New Testament, or a mainstay in my reading life is Meister Eckhart, and so is Ibn Arabi, the great sort of Muslim mystic from the 13th century. And I find the Quran fascinating. I don't subscribe to it as the preeminent voicing of the Godhead in human language, but that doesn't mean I don't find it a wonderful source of so much of the complexity, the deepest forms of complex human articulation. I mean, if you read the Old Testament, it just doesn't get any better in terms of the ability to contain the contradictions that comprise the totality of life itself. There are not a lot of texts that are willing to contain, that are able to contain the extraordinary rhapsodic highs and the extraordinary good that human beings are capable of, and the declivitous and craven evil that we perpetrate. To read the Old Testament is to recognize that at some level, bloodshed is part of our experience, and we will never escape it. So the notion that somehow we would wish to heal ourselves of this perpetual violence, say, the Old Testament teaches us in a way that that's really the wrong question. And I think that there aren't a lot of texts that are willing to go there. But the sacred texts, the old sacred texts, tend to be the ones that do.
Ayad Akhtar, dreams are fertile ground in your life and work. Some of your dreams have been powerful premonitions. Can you talk a bit about that?
Sure. I started keeping track of my dreams at the advice of a mentor in my early 20s, and did so almost religiously for about 4 or 5 years. I would sleep at night with a pad next to the bed, and I would wake up every 45 minutes and would write down the dream I was having. And most nights I was remembering upward of 8 or 9 dreams a night. And in addition to sort of noting these dreams and recording them, I was also scouring the psychoanalytic sources and also the mythic sources for some wisdom about dream interpretation or what it was that dreams were doing. What was the purpose? What was the function? And how could I relate to this stuff? And one of the things that it, I think, taught me was something about creative process and about the way that language works, the way that emotion, memory, expectation, and meaning come together and become decoupled. And I think that in a way that art is a kind of extension of a field of experience that is maybe contiguous or somewhere in between the dream state and the waking state that we go through. And one of the pleasures that we have in art when it's done well is the kind of absorption or loss of a sense of space or a sense of time as we are immersed in the inner flow, the inner emotional and idea flow of an experience that's so similar to a dream. One of the other things that's been fascinating about keeping such close tabs on my dreams is that it has made me question the nature of the time-space continuum, as I mentioned in the book. I have had many strange experiences that I cannot account for or explain, meeting people in dreams before I meet them in real life, and notably something I've spoken about in the past, for example, say a premonition around an attack. I dreamt of a terrible attack at the center of Manhattan 2 days before 9/11. So, it's hard to make any. I can't make any claims about that because I don't really know what it's all about. I just know that clearly the time-space continuum is more complicated than we experience it to be on a regular basis, on a daily basis.
The attacks of September 11th, 2001 were a turning point for you and other Americans of Muslim background. How did you feel the impact of that event?
Overnight, I mean, in addition to the sort of, widespread anxiety, confusion, and fear that I think all Americans felt, I also had the experience of being identified, as I often say that before 9/11, well, my mother used to say before 9/11 they had no idea who we were or where we were from, and after 9/11 we could have only been from somewhere bad. So that was a very, real experience that happened. Again, my purpose in articulating that isn't to bemoan it. It's to state it as a fact, because it is a fact. And it contributes to, I would say that maybe the deeper thematic preoccupation of the book, of Homeland Elegies, is the social construction of the self, the ways in which the society provides the experiences and the discourses and the practices and the attitudes that shape an individual's response to all of that, which becomes the personality, which becomes the interior. We often like to think of our interiors as something unique and separate from the world, but I don't think they are. I think we are contiguous with the world. So in order to tell that story of the social construction of the self in America at this particular moment, 9/11 was an unavoidable, landmark in the landscape, especially for me.
In the novel, you describe a return visit to Pakistan in 2008 that brought home to you how much had changed there as well. What did you see or hear during your time there?
Well, what I contend in the book is that the country is increasingly overrun with conspiracy theories, where corruption is run rampant, where there's very little trust in news from reputed sources, where income inequality has gotten so bad that you can't imagine how you would solve it. And of course, all of this tracks very much against what has happened in the United States. And, we are now in the grip of a kind of insane cult of conspiracy theories that believe that President Trump is doing what he can to protect the American people from Democrats stealing their children and drinking their blood. It would sound absurd if it was in a Stephen King novel, but the fact is this is growing like wildfire in the United States, and we have sitting members, recently elected members of Congress who are espousers of these theories. So, what I suggest in the book is that in 2008, I was already seeing signs of what I called widespread mass psychosis. That is to say, a society's inability to properly function because of its inability to perceive reality as it is. And all of those markers that I'm describing are really very similar, if not identical, to the very things happening in the United States. So in a way, as I've said before, the book is really about America. It's a portrait of America. So even when I'm in Pakistan, or when the narrator's in Pakistan talking about Pakistan, he's really talking about America. Everything is opportunistic in that way in the book. I'm trying to point the portrait always back to the United States.
Well, it was around that time, in 2008, that you found, or your alter ego found, a new direction in his writing through what he describes as his Scranton epiphany. What was that? What happened?
So in the book, the narrator's car breaks down, his engine overheats and gets pulled over by a state trooper, who at first is very helpful, is sort of, says there's white smoke coming out of your exhaust, let's take a look at the engine. And they get into a conversation which, a series of anodyne questions about name and where you're from begin to elicit a kind of suspicion on the part of the trooper, which leads to some white lies being told, that the narrator lies to this police officer, and then that has ramifications. And that's the beginning of this 24-hour period in Scranton, where he will then his car will end up at the car mechanic's garage, and that car mechanic is the uncle of the state trooper, and the ramifications of what happened on the road then continue as he can't really get his car back. And anyway, so without going into great detail about what happens in the scenes, it's really, I'm dramatizing this sort of sense of exclusion, or the sense of the social consequence of widespread suspicion, in a way that starts off totally anodyne, but it begins to have cascading impact or cascading consequences. And at the end of this 24-hour period, he's finally gotten his car back, though he's had to, get an credit card extension on his Wells Fargo credit card at 24% interest, and he is driving back to the city. And this is after having had a long dream that night, in which the dilemma of his Muslim family, if you will, is laid bare very clearly. What the really central dilemma of their dangling nature, their dangling experience in the American experiment, if you will. He has this realization, he's driving back to the city, that he's not going to pretend that he feels comfortable in this country anymore, and that from that epiphany, a series of artistic works, would be born. And of course, I'm referring to, not only the play that would eventually become the play that he speaks about in the book, which is Disgraced, or is largely inspired by Disgraced, but also the book itself, the book that the reader is reading at that very moment.
Although, whatever its source, the explosion of creativity that came from that decision was truly impressive. And here I can speak to your life. In the course of 8 months, you wrote drafts of 3 plays and the first draft of your novel, American Dervish. One of the plays, yes, Disgraced, directly confronted questions of dual identity and Islamophobia through the story of Amir, the corporate lawyer who's the one who acknowledged taking a certain pride in the fall of the towers. But I was wondering, has the reaction of the Muslim community bothered you? With your critiques of Islam taken as attacks on the faith or the community?
Yes, I think there's been a long-standing disgruntlement would be a kind word for what a lot of folks feel toward me from my own community. It's hard. It makes me sad. I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding of what the nature of art or an artist is meant to be doing. I think that when you don't have a lot of representations out there, I think that folks expect that if there's going to be a representation by somebody from the community, it should be positive. And basically what they're hoping for is some, advertising or PR, really. Folks want a role model. They want to feel encouraged about where they come from. I'm not sure that's the job of an artist. I'm not sure it's ever been the job of an artist. But it is obviously a complicated proposition to be writing meaningfully and in complicated ways about where you come from in a culture that doesn't necessarily that's not necessarily inclined to see you as equal to it, right? So in the book, there's a character who quotes Norbert Elias, the great German sociologist, and Norbert Elias beautifully, put this beautifully succinctly. He said that the dominant majority fashions its we image from a minority of its best, and it fashions the they image of the despised outsiders from a minority of its worst. And so this is the mechanism whereby 19 hijackers can come to stand in for the totality of a religion, right? An entire religion. Is the dominant majority fashions its image of the outsider from a minority of its worst. And so the extent to which an artist is possibly articulating human frailty and exposing the flawed and contradictory nature of the human condition as experienced by members of his own community, well, those are not seen as the minority of the best struggling with life. It's seen often as the minority of the worst who can't get it right. And, again, is that my problem? I don't know, maybe, but I've never felt that it was my problem. I felt that was the dominant majority's problem. And I wasn't going to I wasn't going to change what it was that I was doing because, eggheads out there didn't seem to be able to understand that I was writing from the particular to the universal. I guess I'm coming back to that question of the particular to the particular. But to me, and I often joke, but there's a lot of truth to it. If I was interested in advertising and public relations, I would have gone into that and made a lot more money doing it. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in a quest for what's real and what's true about human life.
But there's a lot of anger in this play and sadness. In
this play or in the book?
I mean, even in Disgraced.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, Disgraced is a howl of rage. I think that was what it was described as in the very first review in the Chicago Tribune that sort of set off all of the stuff that ultimately led to the Pulitzer. I think very accurately it was described as a howl of rage. Which William Gaddis once said, I mean, one of our greatest writers, when a writer runs out of rage, he or she runs out of anything to write about. I mean, it's not new that an artist is speaking out against the injustice of creation or the injustice of society or we wouldn't litigate James Baldwin's rage. So what's the question? I mean, and I don't mean it to you. This is a sort of larger conversation that I'm constantly, in the throes of, because somehow to express anger as a member of the despised minority is to echo the minority of the worst. I don't think that's true. I think that's a social mechanism that exists within a society where the dominant majority is not the race or identity that I'm from, and I'm not going to allow or enable that logic to make my art. It's just not. It's not where I want to be.
And Akhtar, the final. It's not that I just we're running out of time. I have to go to the next question.
It's fine. It's all good. It's all good. I appreciate. Look, I got to say, I appreciate the chance to speak this openly and honestly about all this stuff. I mean, I can hear the welcome in your questions and in your listening. So it's what enables me to actually say some of this stuff, which I usually just say in my work. I try to avoid saying it on a radio show or in an interview because invariably it's almost invariably misconstrued. So.
To go back to Homeland Elegies, the final chapter is devoted once again to the narrator's father, and as you were saying, at this point in his life is kind of falling apart because of drinking and gambling and a lawsuit that is destroying his career and so on. But the father is longing to be home.
Yeah.
And I think you've acknowledged that your own father was longing to be home. Did that surprise you?
I mean, I suppose in a way it did, though I think there was probably an inevitability or an emotional inevitability to it. There were things about Pakistan that he, as much as he sort of like looked down on it, there were things that he never really, didn't stop doing. There was certain kind of music that he never stopped listening to, and, he loved Pakistani food in a way that would make constant fun of every other cuisine and compare it to, North Indian and Pakistani food, which was, the summum bonum. So there were cultural habits that were so deeply ingrained that whatever his love of America was, it was clear that there were certain appetites that were only going to be satisfied by his native experience. And so at the end of his life, when he spoke constantly about wanting to go back to Pakistan, after, not saying that at all. I mean, sort of, if anything, making fun of Pakistan much of his adult life in this country. It wasn't really that much of a surprise. But certainly makes for an interesting and evocative and I think deeply meaningful reversal in a dramatic story, because there is a shift there. I think that it does point to the way that America, at least for my two parents, was never really a home. It was a permanent destination but their home was always somewhere else. And that perhaps there is something about that instability of belonging in the American experience, which seems to happen to so many generation after generation, that being American is about, I suppose, accepting certain ideas as your own, as the important ideas. But for immigrants who come here, being American doesn't mean being home the way that being home meant where they grew up, and that contradiction is never solved. It's maybe less acute for some people than others, but it's never a solved dilemma.
In the coda to the novel, you declare yourself American. You don't want to be anywhere else, you say. America is your home. What?
I think I also think it's the second to last sentence to say. I think I say something like, "I've never even thought about it. I don't want to be anywhere else. I've never even thought about it." Well, of course, I've spent 360 pages thinking about it. So, but yes, I think at the end of the book, it's clear that this narrator and his consciousness and the cast of his being is fundamentally American, and there are progenitors, if you will, whether it's Mary Maroney, his mentor, his teacher, who is an American but also an intellectual and a critic of the American experience in a way, and Whitman and others who, as Americans, were able to also articulate the flaws of this country, and so this narrator is, at least in the course of the book, making a case for himself as one of those people who can both be American but can operate as a kind of conscience for his fellow citizens, someone who can maybe reflect back some of the conundrums, the moral dilemmas that we must deal with if we are going to flourish. Of course, the irony being that at the end of the book, a classroom that he's part of is reading Whitman, is reading Democratic Vistas, and Whitman's critique of the American experience is basically the same one that the narrator has 150 years later. So, yeah.
But that affirmation of American identity, can we conflate you and your narrator here?
I think we probably can. I think we probably should. I am American. I wouldn't know. I mean, if I lived somewhere else, I would feel only more American. I know that when I've lived in Europe, I've longed for American stuff. New Yorker magazines and stuff that I was just, the cast of my sort of American preoccupation has never been so clear to me as when I was living in Paris or Germany. It's like I was really not Parisian. I was really not German. I was American.
Something you couldn't have anticipated is that your book would be published during the time of a global pandemic and one that's caused so much pain in the United States.
Indeed.
How does that color or maybe sharpen your view of what's going on in your country today?
Well, I think that I worried before the book came out that the portrait I was painting of a country in disrepair and widespread disrepair and sort of morally foundering was one that only some would be able to identify with. But clearly, since the pandemic and the chaos and disarray and the rot, really, the sort of institutional rot that has been laid bare so clearly, I think it's a lot easier for folks to inhabit the book and recognize the country that the narrator is showing them. And I think that, if anything, the pandemic has made the book's case that much more urgent and that much clearer. It's also made it harder to release a book, in the sense that, it's one of the great joys of a book release is traveling to bookstores and meeting booksellers and readers and meeting folks, the local press, the local radio stations, and the local reporters, and getting to know a community a little bit. That's something that, of course, I'm just sitting in an apartment on the phone or in front of a computer, all day long doing that sort of stuff. It's a very different experience in that way.
The novel has also come out on the eve of a presidential election, which is something that you could predict, knowing the dates. But during a time of acute polarization in American society, I mean, the situation changes by the minute. But what do you make of this particular moment?
I mean, it's an absolutely dreadful program that just does not seem to end. It doesn't seem to have an ending. It's like one of those, serials that the only purpose of the serial is to get renewed for the next season, and throw out every stop and every possible narrative twist to keep it going. I mean, that's a facile way of putting it, but it does speak to the kind of underlying social logic that has taken over politics. Entertainment is the dominant mode of politics and the dominant mode of thought. We increasingly substitute a good story or a hot story for the truth. We're not even interested in the truth. We just want to be entertained. We want to be distracted. We want to be absorbed in the clatter. And so I think that's what you get when that's what you want. And I hope that I just hope that we're going to be delivered from this constant insanity. We as a nation are having to somatize and process the insanity and childishness of our president every single day. His mental illness has become ours every single day. We did elect him, and yes, it is reflective of something wrong with us. But good God, I mean, if this is not a case of the symptom becoming almost worse than the disease.
You've said that writing this book changed something inside of you, something that you didn't know needed changing or were yearning to change. What's different now?
Hard to articulate. It's a feeling of something settled, something secured, which was long adrift or long bound to the core by some makeshift way, but now seems to have become integrated to the center. It's part of me, whatever this is, and I'm grateful for that. I didn't know that a book could do that, but I'm grateful that and hopefully it'll last. We'll see.
It's really a pleasure to have the chance to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. This is it's a pleasure and an honor.
You've been listening to Books and Ideas Audio, a presentation of the Vancouver Writers' Fest. You can find Ayad Akhtar's Homeland Elegies wherever books or audiobooks are sold, including through the Vancouver Writers' Fest's Libro FM store. To hear more events like this one, please visit our website at writersfest.bc.ca.